Yo, what's going on, guys? Today, I'll be teaching you how to count Elixir in Clash Royale. To put it simply, Elixir counting is just knowing how much Elixir your opponent has in hand at any given time. Knowing their Elixir can really help you punish them effectively and know what play to make at a certain time. I've broken it down for you guys into 5 simple tips. Before we get into the tips, I would recommend you guys save this video to your watch later. To count Elixir does require quite a bit of practice, so you guys may have to come back to this video a few times. The other thing is that these tips play into each other, so make sure you pay close attention to all of them. Before we dive deep into Elixir counting, we do have to go over some of the basics with tip number 1. So tip number 1 is, when they go for a card in the back after a match reset point, that very likely means that they're at 10 Elixir. Of course they could be bluffing, but most of the time they will be at 10 when they go for a card in the back. The other thing is, if they go for a card late, like say you play a Goblin Barrel and they play their arrows onto it a few seconds late, you probably know that they were just at that 3 Elixir right as they played those arrows, so they're now at 0 Elixir right after they spent those arrows. So I just want you guys to start thinking about those small indicators. For tip number 2, we have watching your replays. Hear me out, guys. I know watching replays can be pretty boring, but I do have a nice proposal for you. So look, hop into Clash Royale and play a few games. Don't play anything intense like Path of Legends. Just do something simple like maybe Trophy Road or some party game mode even, and just try to be a bit more mindful about how much Elixir your opponent has in hand at any given time. Don't use any special techniques or anything, just play the game. Think about their Elixir and how much they had in hand, and then go back and watch those replays and see if you are roughly correct about their Elixir. And don't waste your time watching the whole replay, just kind of skim through it, use the fast forward button, whatever you have to do to just learn a thing or two. And yeah, after that, you'll be ready to move on to tip number 3. Tip number 3 may be the most important, but the other 2 tips after this are important as well. Tip 3 is to do quick math in your head. That really is what Elixir counting comes down to. I know it seems pretty wild to try to do math in your head as you're playing an intense Clash Royale game, but it's not quite as complicated as it sounds. So, I want you guys to try to do something similar to what you did for tip number 2, to where you go into some low intensity game, something like a party mode game, anything like that, and just play a few matches and try to do simple math in your head as you're playing. So, once you hit 10 Elixir at the start of the match, you and your opponent will have 10 Elixir, and if they play like say a Hog Rider, they're going to be at 6. If they combo an Earthquake with that, they're going to be at 3 Elixir, and so on. Just try to do those simple calculations, and after you're finished with the match, you can either go back and see the replay to see if you are correct or incorrect, or sometimes you might be able to tell live whether you are correct or incorrect based on certain indicators, like after a match reset point when they play a card in the back, you might be able to tell whether you were correct or incorrect about their Elixir. And I'll be honest with you guys, even top players don't really do that math in their head as they're playing, but it's just a good way to get your brain used to what you need to do in order to Elixir count, because as top players, we just practice it so much that at this point we don't really do any math. We just have our brains automatically calculate things. Like when we see a card being played, we automatically know that, oh, that's a certain amount of Elixir, so they're going to have a certain amount of Elixir in their hand now, and we just have a very good feel for how much Elixir they're going to have at any given moment. And it can be so important because if you think about it, say you have a Hog Rider deck and your opponent has an Inferno Tower to defend it. If they're at 3 Elixir, you can either go for that Hog right away, or if you weren't accounting for their Elixir, then you might go for it a second later. And if you go for it a second later, it's going to be the difference between getting like half their tower or getting 0 damage. Tip number 4 is to not overthink double and triple Elixir. Single Elixir is where Elixir counting is key. I know some of you will try to go crazy counting in double and triple Elixir, but guys, trust me, single Elixir is what you need to focus on. In single Elixir, if you know your opponent's Elixir, you can so easily punish them, but in double and triple Elixir, it's so easy for them to just gain that Elixir they need to defend super quickly, so it's not really as important, and especially in triple Elixir, the Elixir just flows like crazy, so it really doesn't matter if you know what Elixir your opponent has. So don't focus on that too much, mainly focus on single Elixir. Tip number 5 is to give up on Elixir counting if you play Elixir Golem or your opponent plays Elixir Collector. I'm just kidding, but if either one of those cards are in a match, you do have to pay extra attention in order to count Elixir well still. You guys can see this chart on screen here. If you leave an Elixir Collector all alone, it does produce 8 Elixir, giving your opponent a 2 Elixir advantage, but you can also see how each spell does against it, how much Elixir it takes away from the Collector, and all the way to the right you can see what trade it gets overall against the Collector. Only the Earthquake gets a +1 trade, all the other spells there get negative trades. It's important for Elixir counting to know how much Elixir you'll be up or down based on what spell you play on the collector, if any. And with Elixir Golem, it's very simple. Basically, just know that your opponent will gain 4 Elixir from you playing that E-Golem, and that's really all there is to it. That's all of our tips for today, but I do have one bonus tip about something else. I get a lot of questions about how to keep track of your opponent's card cycle. Honestly, it's not really important to keep track of your opponent's card cycle most of the time, but in certain matchups it can be. Like, say you're playing Logbait, you do want to keep track of when your opponent has Login cycle, or if you're playing Hog Rider, you want to know when your opponent has a Tornado in cycle. So basically what you do is you just keep track of the 1 to 2 cards that are the most important for you to know when they have it in cycle. You can keep track of all cards, but you mainly want to focus on those 1 to 2 because especially in double and triple Elixir, it does get really hectic if you try to keep track of every single card. So basically just count until they cycled 4 cards after they played the card you're trying to keep track of, and that's when they have it back in cycle. Unless they have a champion on the field, then it only takes them 3 cards to get back to that card. Just practice that and eventually you'll start to be able to count cycle pretty well. I just want to give you guys a quick example of card counting. So look, this guy goes for the Sparky in the back. I was playing 2.6. In this type of matchup, it can be a bit difficult to break through unless you catch your opponent in a bad cycle. So counting cycle can be pretty important. When you're playing something like 2.6, you always want to keep track of where their hog counters are in cycle. So look, I was just defending here, not really thinking too much. Just wanted to not lose my tower. Then he wasted the rage and I started thinking a bit. I knew I would get to my Evo skeletons as my next set of skeletons, so I was starting to keep track of his rage. So at this point he was 4 cards away from the rage. I didn't want to support the musketeer, just wanted to see what he would do against it. He ended up wasting the mini Pekka, a pretty good hog counter. But I knew he also had barbarians as well in his deck. He already played the normal barbs, so I knew he would get to the Evo barbs for our next hog rider. I didn't want to try to go for a prediction fireball or anything because that could be a bit risky. So look, at this point I knew he was still 2 cards away from the rage, so I went for the hog rider Evo skeletons and I knew he couldn't stop them. Just watch what happens, just from counting card cycle. At this point he did get back to rage, but he didn't decide to play it right away, or maybe he didn't have the elixir. The Evo skeletons just went crazy. He eventually played the rage, but you guys can just see how good of an interaction that was simply by counting his card cycle. I also said you don't have to count your opponent's elixir much in double and triple elixir. So you guys can see in this match, once I hit double elixir, I pretty much just started spamming my cycle cards over and over again, not really caring too much. Of course, even in double and triple elixir, it's still good to have a rough feel of your opponent's elixir, but you really don't have to count specific elixir. Make sure to subscribe if you learned anything new from this video. Thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye!